It is my pleasure to introduce our two speakers for today, Dr. Carmen Rasmussen and Dr. Jacqueline Pye. Dr. Rasmussen is an assistant professor in the Department of Pediatrics and member of the Center for Neuroscience at the University of Alberta. She is also a research affiliate at the Glenrose Rehabilitation Hospital. Dr. Pye is a registered psychologist specializing in neuropsychological assessment. She is also an assistant professor in educational psychology, an assistant clinical professor in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Alberta. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Pye and Dr. Rasmussen.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Colleen. That's great. Now, if I can get my technology rolling, there we go. So I'm just going to start by letting everybody know a little bit about our goals for the session today. We want to start, so we're talking about interventions that are language-based today. So that's kind of our focus, cognitive interventions that are language-based. But before we jump right into the interventions, we wanted to spend a little bit of time talking a little bit about what evidence-based intervention means and what your role is, and kind of start shifting our thinking away from all of our evidence has to come only from the researchers, and rather how we can kind of engage in a little bit more dialogue around how research can take place and how we can gather evidence. So we're going to start there. Then we're going to talk a little bit about language impairments and FASD, because if we want to talk about the interventions, we need to kind of understand what's going on and what intervention we're trying to do. Then we'll review the specific research that's been done with regards to interventions into language impairments and FASD. Then what we'll do is we'll discuss a few interventions that are used, language interventions that are used with other populations. So what else can we learn from? Because frankly, there's very little done in terms of formal research into language interventions with individuals affected by FASD. Whoa, my slides are jumping. And finally, we want to wrap up by really talking about some of the practical nuts and bolts and what does that mean and what can we do, and can we talk about some strategies and what can this look like. So taking that research to sort of an applied practical place. So that's where we want to end up and wrap up. As you were already told and Colleen indicated, we welcome your questions throughout, and we're happy to kind of continue to think about how to put a practical and meaningful bent on this. But the first thing I'm going to start with is talking about what it means. Well, there's a little thing in the middle of my slideshow there. Oh, Jackie. There we go. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about research intervention, what it means, and what does evidence-based practice mean. So when we do research looking at interventions, we're always talking about evidence to do what we do. And what are we really talking about? Well, essentially, when we say that something is empirically supported, these are the languagings we use, we're saying that it's effective according to scientific standards. So that means we know that if we control for all these different things, so if I have a child who's doing a reading intervention, I have control for the fact that they had breakfast that day, that they had a good sleep that night, that they're getting the same intervention, that they're the same age, that they had the same problem to begin with. Then we do the intervention, and then we say, did it work? And we measure how they were doing before and we measure how they're doing after. We say, hey, the intervention worked. So as long as they all ate breakfast and they all slept and they all had the same problem and the intervention worked. Wow, a lot of control there. But then according to scientific standards, we can say, hey, it works. That's one aspect of what we do. Then what we say is we look at how it's a little bit more applied. And I'm going to talk to that a little bit more, because that scientific piece is sometimes not always what is as meaningful to everybody else in the day-to-day real world. In terms of those scientific standards, that high level of control, when we look at the body of research around FASD and we say how many empirically supported scientific studies do we have looking at interventions this way, we're at about 12, maybe up to 12 to 15. That's a very, very small number. And that's not just language. I'm talking into everything. So when you hear that number, you should be going, how on earth do we even know what to do? I see faces in front of me going, whoa, what do we do? If that's the number we have, what do we do? Well, you know what? We need to keep doing that. It's important and helpful, but we also need to go beyond that so that we can start expanding our practice in an informed way. And that's why I want to talk to you guys a little bit about today. So back to kind of these ideas of what is evidence-based practice. We break it down into different things. And when I talk about that scientific evidence, right, all that control, did you have breakfast, did you sleep, all these things, I'm kind of talking about research efficacy. Does it work in the lab? Because, right, that's what we're essentially saying. Can I get it to work in the lab? And you guys are all going, well, so what? It works in the lab. What does it really mean? What you're asking is about whether it's meaningfully effective. So it's one thing for us to say something works in the lab. Then we have to take it to the community. We have to go into a school and we have to say, is that actually meaningful? Maybe this intervention works in the lab, but in the school, it's not practical. There are 30 kids in that class. There's no way that I can invest 3 hours in the intervention for my one child in a classroom. That's not meaningful. So in a lab, it might be great if you can spend 3 hours with a kid and make something work. But in a classroom, that's not going to work. So when we're talking about interventions, it's not enough for us to say it's got scientific evidence and research efficacy. We also know if it's effective. Is it effective? Does it really meaningfully work for us day to day? Then we get to the third question, which is it feasible? So maybe it's great and it doesn't take a whole lot of time. We can get it into the classroom. It's super. It's a little bit of technology the kids use. It's not going to take teacher time. But the technology costs $1 million. I'm making it up. But somebody might say, okay, that's not feasible. We can't afford to do that for every child. So that's the next level of questions. So we need to ask questions at all these levels. It's important that we have that lab scientific evidence. That is important. That helps us. That helps to direct us. But then we really need to know how it's meaningful, and we really need to know if it's feasible. That's kind of how we organize research as researchers looking into intervention. That's one way we can gain information about interventions that are effective. But you know what? It's only one way. And it's one thing that we will talk about, and Carmen's going to talk a little bit today about the research and some of that evidence that we have. But before she does that, I want to talk about the fact that I think we can get evidence another way. I don't think that's the only way information flows. Because there's a lot of you folks out there right now who are already doing interventions. You're doing something. You're in a home, you're in a classroom, you're somewhere, you're already doing things. You're trying to intervene, you're trying to make a change for a child in some way. So we need to start capturing that as well. The information needs to kind of start flowing both ways, not just what do the researchers say and how do we do it in practice, but what do the practitioners say and how do we bring that back to research? Information can go both ways because there are really valuable things that are happening in practice right now. So part of our presentation, as I said at the beginning today, is I want to give you guys a little sense of a model that you can use that's not all that far off from what you're probably already doing, but can allow some of that capturing of information in a way that we can open those lines of communication, maybe even more so between us, so we can start capturing and spreading the information about what you're currently doing. Because we need evidence. We need to be able to say we know why things are working. Usually when you're doing an intervention, you'll say, I really believe it's working. My gut feeling is it's working, or you're sort of tracking that it's working. You're doing it for a reason. You're believing in it for a reason. We just need to capture that so that more people can do it, so that we can spread that information to people who are paying the money that allow us to keep doing that, so policies can be built to use that. So that information doesn't just have to come from researchers. We can support you in the community if we kind of help you look at systems for starting to track it so that you can communicate it back, and then we can share it that way. So let's get into the nuts and bolts. So the model that I want to share with you, or the kind of thinking, and it's model is a very loose terminology here, but I'm somebody who likes a little bit of organizational structure, because if I don't have it, I don't tend to be all that organized. So I like to think about it as investing in our intervention efforts. What that means is intervention is more than a fly-by-night thing. You're not just doing it on a whim. You've thought about it and you're doing it with some kind of intention. And what I'm thinking we need to do is just invest a little bit more in those efforts that are already out there and those things that you're already doing. So breaking down invest, I like acronyms and little meaningful jumpy words, so bear with me. But when we break down invest, step one, we're identifying what is the problem area and what are the goals that we have. Number two, we want to name indicators of success, what will tell us that our intervention is successful. Three, we want to validate our assumptions. We then want to execute our program. We want to seek outcomes and understanding, and then we want to tweak and transfer. Let me tell you what this looks like, and let me provide sort of an example as we go through this. First step, identify problems and goals. What does that mean? What's the issue? What am I worried about? What's the concern? And sometimes we have many of them. One of the tricks when we're thinking about intervention is narrowing it down. Sometimes we have to kind of narrow it. I know we want to do everything and we want to fix everything, but when we're thinking about intervention and how we can resolve things, oftentimes we have to really be able to say, no, you know what, right now, right here, my biggest priority is this. How am I going to deal with this? What is that issue? What is my program goal, or what is my classroom goal, or what is my goal in my home or my family? What is my goal? What am I hoping to accomplish? I need to be very specific. I can have an overall goal and sub-goals, but I generally need to be specific. So here, let's provide an example, because examples always help bring it home for me anyway. So I've got Sam, and I decide I want to improve Sam's reading comprehension. He's in school, he's reading things, and he never seems to understand what he's reading. And I really think that reading comprehension is a problem. I've done a reading test maybe with him, and I find his reading comprehension is really low. So I say, that's my goal. Improve his reading comprehension, that's it. Within those, I have a couple of sub-goals. I'm thinking, you know what, I'm going to reduce, if I can improve his reading comprehension, I think that's also going to help reduce his frustration. I think if he's understanding it, his frustration will go down. And then I think my other goal is he's going to feel more positive about the classroom. Okay, that's kind of what I'm thinking. There's some goals, they're pretty clear. All right, I've identified the problem, reading comprehension, and these secondary things of frustration and feeling good about school. And I've said these are the things I want to deal with. Okay, step one. These are things that you're doing day to day all the time. I'm not asking this is nothing new. If you're working with kids, you do this all the time. So I'm just saying being intentional. Name indicators of success. Okay, so now I know that I want to do these things. What would tell me that something had changed? So what would tell me one of those things was different? How would I know that there had been an improvement? Well, Sam's performance on a reading comprehension test would improve. So whatever that test we did in school at first that he did poorly on, he'd do a little bit better on it. Okay, something got better. That would be a good indicator that something improved. Things, again, you're often doing. Maybe also, in terms of my sub-goal, I'd find that he's not getting quite so upset. He's not blowing up in the classroom as often. It's happening less often. Fairly easy to track, things that I can keep close tabs on without a whole lot of effort. And his attendance is better in school, which maybe tells me that he's not so upset about school. I don't know, I'm thinking maybe those are my indicators. They're very clear, they're very concrete, they're things that I can easily monitor without a whole lot of effort, but they're the kind of things that might give me insight. Okay, those are my indicators of success. All right, I've thought about this, it's taken me 10 minutes because I've been I don't have a lot of time. I've got 30 kids in my classroom, for instance, or I've got a busy household, but here's what I do. These are the things I've come up with. What do I do next? I need to kind of validate things. So I go to my colleagues, maybe at school, maybe I'm a teacher, and I say, so I'm working on Johnny, or Sam's, changing names here, Sam, we're Sam today. I'm working on Sam's comprehension, and I think that if he gets a little bit better in reading, we might see the frustration come down. Do you guys notice that in your classrooms, that some of his outbursts maybe are tied to frustration with the learning? Yeah, I noticed that too. Okay, all right, so I think my assumption there sounds like it makes sense. You know what, I was reading a research article, I was at a presentation the other day, I went to a conference, and they were saying that language sometimes is one of the greatest points of frustration for kids, and that often behavioral problems, and this is true actually, by the way, often behavioral problems that we see in children are a reflection of underlying language problems and the fact that they're simply not understanding. And it's better to be bad than it is to be dumb, or sometimes it's just simply frustrating. Right? If I suddenly started speaking in French right now, or some other language, or that nobody knows, I shouldn't say French because probably a lot of you speak it, but a language that nobody knows, it could become very frustrating, and you're not going to be particularly engaged because you're not going to understand. So I check though. I look at the research, I say, yeah, they said that at the conference, my colleagues are agreeing, so I think that it's reasonable for me to assume that this high frustration is tied to the fact that he's having trouble understanding what he's reading. Okay, that makes sense. What about the attention? Or the attendance. Can I think that that's really tied to school satisfaction? Well, I talked to one teacher and they're saying, yeah, you know what? He says, I hate school, I can't do school anyway, why do I even show up? He says that all the time. Oh, okay, so it does sound like the hating school, maybe that's tied. I don't know, it might make sense. Maybe I call a caregiver, they say, yeah. I'm checking on my assumptions. I'm saying, do these things make sense? Can I really expect these things to happen? So, and again, those can be quick conversations. I'm not talking about investing copious amounts of time in deep research, but we're doing things that we generally probably do a lot of the time. If you're struggling with somebody's behavior, you might be saying, why am I seeing all these outbursts? Why is this happening? That's what we're doing here. Then we do our program. We say, okay, I've got this program because somebody told me we should do it. In this case, I'm saying I've heard that pairing, reading with an audio recording is really helpful. So if I can have their reading material in an audio format while they're simultaneously reading it. So they're reading it and they're hearing it. Some people say that works. I'm going to try that with Sam and see if that works for him. So that's the intervention. Simple, straight. It's not going to take too much of my time, so I'm going to give it a roll. Is it going to work? We'll see. What do? I look for change. So a couple weeks go by and I say, well, what's happened in the last 2 weeks? Is there less frustration? Is there more school attendance? Am I seeing a change in comprehension? So I do another little comprehension test, a quick little paragraph read with some questions. Wow, it's a little bit better actually. I'm seeing a little bit improvement. That's good. That might mean there's some success here. I'm going to make a note of that in my notes where I'm kind of tracking this. And he actually had less absences and less lates in the last 2 weeks than I'd seen in the time before that. So that's a good sign. But you know what? He's still getting kind of frustrated. I'm still seeing that frustration. What is that? Let me watch. You know what? He's in a really busy spot in the classroom. So he's sitting here listening to this thing, and all these other kids are yipping and yapping, and he's kind of going like this. Like, I wonder if it's just too noisy for him. Maybe my intervention is okay, but he has to move somewhere. I wonder. I'm going to move him to another part of the classroom and see what happens. So I'm looking at how things are working. I'm not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I'm just tweaking it a little bit and saying, look I can do this, and now how are things going? Oh, look at that. I've got him in a quiet part of the classroom when he's doing his reading. Frustration has come down. Bingo. We've seen a little bit of success. That's great. Fantastic. I'm going to make a note of that, and we're going to keep using this. And transfer. I'm going to tell other people about it. I'm going to say, do you know what I found is that Sam really responded well to this type of intervention in these kinds of conditions. You also may want to try it. You may, blog onto one of our blog sites and say, hey, all you intervention folks out there, I was tracking this and I found that this was reduced and this and frustration went down and attendance went up and comprehension went up. I'm tracking that evidence. I kept track of it. I was writing notes. It took me 5 minutes. Not a whole lot of time, but I had that written evidence. I have some indicator, so I can start talking to you about that. And maybe I'll try it with a few other kids, and maybe I'll keep track of it with a few other kids. Again, not overly time consuming, but it then gives me information that I can share with people that's a little bit more tangible. Now, a lot of this isn't different than a lot of what you're doing probably all the time. All we're suggesting is that we want to be more intentional about it. Think about the fact that you're moving through this process, record it a little bit, and then be in a position to share it back. Share it back to your teaching community, your caregiver group communities. Share it back to us and look at other places where we can start speaking to the types of strategies and approaches that are seeing effectiveness, because that will help inform our practice. If we wait until we have all the research evidence in the world, you guys are going to be waiting a long time before you can say you got evidence-based practice. I mean, we're working. We really are. But it takes a long time. If instead you start saying, hey, you know what? We can contribute to this. We're not just recipients of this information. We're not just the receivers. We're the doers. We know stuff. We have knowledge up here. We know a lot more than you know because we're living it. Let us start finding ways to share that information back to you so that we can start informing the way that we message intervention information. Because we can use that practice-based information. When it's documented, when you've thought about these, we can use that information to say, here are the successes, here's the places we need to start investing our energy, our time, our research dollars. And that can help to direct us, that can help us to direct policymakers and do the things that you, because you're living the dream out there doing the work, don't necessarily have the time to do. And we can provide some of that voice. And that's how we begin to be partners in intervention research as opposed to sort of just people working in odds in different places. We want to bring it together and start working. So looking at systems like this and thinking, how might I use this and how could I just be more intentional and record this information to start pushing that information back to those other folks and back to my colleagues and back to the rest of the world. Hey, we can do some cool things together. So I wanted to set that framework for us and have you thinking that way a little bit. Carmen and I are doing a couple other presentations in the next couple of months as well, you may be aware, in terms of talking about memory as well as math interventions. And I want to keep coming back to this model a little bit. I'm not going to repeat it like this in you know, great detail, because nobody wants that. But I want to keep reminding us of the fact that even as we provide information and strategies and talk to you, we invite it back. And even after today, I suspect, you know, we might get some feedback or some thoughts. And those are the kind of thoughts that I would be happy to come back to, even when we're at a next presentation, and to say, hey, guess what? After we talked about language, somebody emailed me this great thing they're doing with math, and they've had this kind of success. Yeah, it's not published, but this is the success, and this is how they're measuring, and this is what they're doing. So we welcome that kind of feedback so that we can then begin sharing that information and get that really practical information out to you guys in terms of how people are having success. So if you know you're having success, start capturing it and documenting it and sharing it so we can get it out there. And now we're going to turn to research, which means that Carmen's going to come here and share some research wisdom with us all.
Thanks, Jackie. So as Jackie said, Jackie was speaking more on the various intervention techniques and strategies that are out there, talking about a lot of the frontline work that's being done. And I'm going to specifically focus on the published work, the published research that has been published on language impairments in FASD and interventions for language both with and without children with FASD, because there's actually really only one published language intervention for children with FASD. So just to get into some information on the language impairments in children with FASD, there actually is quite a bit of published information out there. When we're just talking about general speech and language impairments, there's a couple numbers floating around, but one study found that with children with FASD, they actually found that 80% of their sample had delays in speech and language development. So that's, you know, the vast majority of children with FASD in this sample, so it definitely is a significant impairment. In another study of almost 400 children with FASD, this is a huge study of children with FASD, published by Coggins et al., they found that about 3/4 of their sample had significant language deficits. 31% were in the mildly impaired range and 38% in the moderately to severely impaired range. So it is a pretty big deal, the language impairments in FASD, and they're very common. I invite people to check out any of Coggins' other research. He's a very well-published researcher in the area of language impairments in FASD. So a lot of, he's published quite a bit on it. He's got a lot of other articles. I'm not going to review them all, but and then there's other research that focuses more on the specific types of language impairments in FASD. So the first couple studies are just documenting these global language deficits, but when we actually break down the different research, children with FASD have impairments in a lot of different types of language abilities. So this research here I'm talking about is published with children diagnosed with FASD, but also children with PAE, and I'm sorry that the PAE is not spelled out here. It's prenatal alcohol exposure. So prenatal alcohol exposure would refer to children that are exposed to alcohol, the larger exposed group, but may not meet all the criteria for FASD. So when children come in for a diagnosis, not all of them get diagnosed with FASD, but many still are exposed to alcohol and still have impairment. So we generally refer to those children as having PAE, but not necessarily a diagnosis. So the studies here either study children with PAE or children with FASD. So in one, the Matson and Riley, they found that children with FASD or PAE were impaired on word articulation, word naming, word comprehension, and both the receptive and expressive language. So receptive language is more your understanding of language, whereas expressive language is your spoken language and your ability to produce language. And so they found that they're impaired in both aspects. Language comprehension, so just further research looking at understanding of language. And then a big area is this pragmatic language that Coggins does a lot of research into, and this is more socially appropriate language, and it's really tied to social skills, knowing what to say at the right time, what's appropriate language, and appropriate conversation with other people. So it's really tied to the social skills deficits in FASD. Pragmatic language turns out to be, something that's very difficult for children with autism spectrum disorder that have a lot of the social deficits as well. Linguistic understanding. And then when you just look at their language acquisition, so when children with FASD begin to develop language and their speech development, that is delayed as well. So they tend to speak at later ages and have slightly delayed language acquisition and speech development. So just to go into a couple specific studies here. So one study by Carney and Chermak, they found that older children with FASD had more difficulty with the syntactic aspects of language. So more of the higher level language abilities that are involved in the rules of sentence structure and whatnot, that's what the syntactic aspects are getting at. But the younger children had more of the global language deficits. So they actually suggest that as children with FASD get older, their knowledge and their vocabulary does grow, but they still struggle with a lot of the higher level aspects of language, sentence structure, and grammatical understanding and whatnot. So, and again, it could be related to the fact that as they're older, those skills are more important. So younger children are just speaking words and whatnot, but as they develop, they have to use these more higher level language skills, and that's when we see children with FASD falling further behind their peers in terms of what they're able to do with their language ability. Another study published by McGee et al. Looked at language in children aged 3 to 5 that had significant prenatal alcohol exposure. And again, they found that they were impaired in both receptive and expressive language. And here, they actually found that the expressive language was more severely impaired than the receptive language. But there's other studies that find them to be both equally impaired. So, I mean, this is just one study. So, in general, they were impaired in both, but here they found the expressive to be slightly more impaired. But they found that both receptive and expressive language were not any more impaired than their IQ. So, their language was actually functioning at about the same level as their overall intelligence or IQ. So, it wasn't actually more impaired than IQ. And it doesn't necessarily mean that IQ is the causal factor here. It just means that their language was generally at about the same level as their intellectual or their cognitive functioning. But they really highlight the significant implication of language deficits in FASD here or in PAE and how it negatively affects other things going on in the children's life. So it's not just their receptive and their expressive language, it's affecting their social communication, it's affecting their behavioral judgment and adjustment in school, and it really can lead to a lot of problems in their social life, social rejection, and being able to get along with peers and whatnot when they have these language impairments, especially those pragmatic language impairments, which really emphasize the social awareness. Now, it's really actually hard to say what is the causal factor contributing to language deficits in kids with FASD. You would think, okay, well, they have FASD, it must be caused by the prenatal alcohol exposure. And we're not at a place in research where we can definitely make the statement about what actually causes it. Because when you actually look at the research, we know that children with FASD also tend to have hearing impairments, dental facial abnormalities, and overall cognitive delays. So all of these, as well as prenatal alcohol exposure, probably contribute to the overall language deficit. And it's really hard to say which one came first and which one caused the other. So we're not directly saying that PAE is the root cause. It's a mix of different factors playing a role that result in language impairments. Okay. I'm just going to go into a little bit more detail on one of the studies that we conducted here in Alberta. Wiper and Rasmussen, that we published looking at specific language skills in children with FASD. So we did a number of language tests with children with FASD, hopefully to identify specific aspects of language that they had difficulty on. So before, when I had that slide with all the different types of impairments, those were all different studies looking at different things. So here we tried to do a very broad study looking at very specific skills, so hopefully we could identify if certain skills were more impaired relative to the other ones. So we had 27 children that were diagnosed with FASD through the Glen Rose Hospital, and 23 typically developing controls, and they were aged 5 to 13. I'm not going to go into too much detail on the tests, but one test that they were given was the CREVIT, which is a general test of receptive and expressive vocabulary. So remember, the receptive vocabulary measures your understanding of language, and the expressive is your ability to verbally produce language, okay? And then there were two tests, the TOLD, which is the test of early language development. The P is the preschool version, which was done with the children aged 4 to 8. And then the intermediate, which is the TOLD I, is the other version that's done for children aged 8 to 11. So there's two different versions that we had to do here. There isn't one version that would span the whole age span. So just in general, the things that the tests are measuring. So the TOLD preschool is measuring things like relational vocabulary, some basic grammatical understanding, that's more comprehending the meaning of sentences, sentence imitation, where the children have to produce correct sentences, and then some grammatical completion, where there may be some errors in sentences, and the children have to identify where the errors are and whatnot. Those are the inflections. And then the intermediate gets into a little bit more of this higher level language processing, so word ordering, being able to put words in the correct order. Generals, which gets at more of the speaking and the semantic ability. Grammatical completion, again, where they have to listen to sentences and identify grammar errors and whatnot. And then, I hate pronouncing this word, malapropism, I think I'm saying that right, looking at the receptive language skills. So they had words that are have the incorrect sounds in them and whatnot, and being able to determine whether or not the kids are able to identify those mistakes in language. So in general, remember, all children had the Crevet test. So in general, what we found here is that they were impaired relative to the control children on both the receptive and expressive vocabulary. So this really just confirms all the other research that we're talking about, that it's not just receptive or it's not just expressive. They're showing difficulty in both aspects of language. So here, we probably could have, the average performance here, the mean standard score where children should be is 100. And as you can see, the control children are performing right at average. They're right at 100. And the average score for the FASD is in the about 85-ish. So they're, in general, about one standard deviation below the mean. And although the group differences don't look pretty big here, that actually is a pretty significant difference. And it was statistically significant as well. And importantly here, this also demonstrates that the control group that we chose to compare them to is an adequate control group because they're performing average, which is where we would want them to be. If our control group was also really low, we might start thinking, ooh, where did we get these children from? It could be, they could be children that also have speech and language difficulties that we don't know and whatnot. So it ended up being a pretty good control group. Now, when we look at the TOLD, it uses a different scale. Now here, the average score is a 10. Okay, so that's where you want to be. And again, you can see here the, I guess it's the lime green is the FASD, and the teal greenish color is the control. Here, this is where we get into more different types of language impairment. So this is the preschool TOLD. So the significant differences are starred at the bottom. So they were significantly impaired on the receptive vocabulary, and this is a very big difference. As you can see, the kids with FASD are performing at a standard score of about 6, which is more than a standard deviation below the mean. But when we look at the general grammatical understanding, there wasn't actually any significant difference. You can see the kids with FASD are almost around that average of 10, so they're actually doing pretty good on this. But remember, this is the preschool test, so there's not a lot of grammatical understanding starting yet in the preschool years. But when you ask the kids to repeat sentences, the sentence imitation, again, we see huge impairments in the FASD group, and the control group is doing quite fine there. So this one, again, was significantly different. And then when we get, again, to the other grammatical test, the grammatical completion, where the children had to complete grammar errors in sentences and whatnot, again, here we see there was no significant difference between the preschool, or between the FASD and the control children. So they were not impaired on all aspects of language. That's something that's important to note, because this is really helping us identify the profile of language difficulties. If they're just kind of impaired on everything, then it's really hard to target interventions into what aspects they do need improvement on. Now, when we look at the intermediate TOLD, which was with the older children, again, if you look here, we're starting to see really big differences, again, between the FASD group and the control. So the word ordering test, they were significantly different on there. The generals test, there wasn't a significant difference, although you can see that it was close to significant, and there still was a difference between the scores, it just wasn't statistically significant. But now when we're getting into those higher level language skills involved in syntax and grammar, we do see the grammatical completion. There's a huge difference between the FASD and the controls, and here actually our controls did quite well. They're a little bit above the average of 10. And on those malapropisms, they again were significantly impaired relative to the controls. So what do we make of all this? Well, first of all, they have deficits both in the receptive and expressive language, which supports the previous research out there. It's not just their understanding or their spoken language. They have difficulty in both of them, actually. And those last two graphs, I mean, I know there was a lot of information there, but really to sum it up, again, we're seeing that the younger children have most difficulty with a lot of these general aspects of language, so understanding and expressing the relationships between words and imitating spoken sentences. And again, as the children get older, this is when they're deviating more from their peers and they're having more difficulty in these higher level aspects of language involved in syntax, in grammar, recognizing incorrect grammar, identifying errors in sentences and whatnot. And it doesn't necessarily mean that, like, we didn't find that the younger children were impaired in these areas, probably because you don't expect them to be capable of a lot of those grammatical understanding at such a young age anyways, and so it may take the children to develop older to show these higher level language difficulties. So, but it does have implications for intervention, because with the younger children, you're probably, your interventions are probably going to be want to be more broad and focused on general language, whereas as they get older, you can start tailoring your interventions to focus more on these higher level aspects of language. And again, this is just one study on language in FASD. So, okay. So now I'm going to turn to the research on FASD and language interventions. So actual interventions that are conducted with children with FASD to improve their language. And there's one study. So there's one study that's published in this area looking at language intervention. There are a couple of case studies out there with individual children, but this is the only study that we found published with that wasn't a case study. So this language intervention was actually conducted in South Africa with a group of researchers from the United States, and they did a language and literacy intervention for children with FASD. So they had 4 children that they had diagnosed with FASD in this South African community. They're aged 9 years, so they're starting to get into those higher level language deficits that we talked about in the previous research. And so they randomly assigned them to either an intervention or control group. So this is important. It's one thing just to do an intervention and to show it was effective, but it's more importantly to randomly assign the children to a group where they're not getting the intervention and then show that the intervention group improved, whereas the control group didn't. So it was a well-conducted experiment, and they compared them also to 25 non-exposed children, again to see what would happen with children that aren't exposed. So they had this speech and language intervention where basically the children worked one-on-one with a speech and language therapist twice a week for 9 months. So it's a pretty intensive intervention, and it's a pretty huge time commitment for the researchers. And again, just kind of showing these things aren't necessarily improved in a couple of weeks. This is pretty intensive, labor-intensive intervention. They emphasized a lot of the phonological awareness, sound recognition, and other literacy skills involved in reading and spelling, and I'll talk a bit more about those as we go through it and talk about the results. So again, it's just really one-on-one tutoring with a speech and language therapist, so somebody that was very trained in this area. So they completed various tests of achievement, language, and literacy before and after the intervention. So it's obviously really important to do these before and after the intervention to see whether or not their scores changed relative to children in the control group, where you wouldn't expect their scores to change. Or maybe they would change somewhat, because over a 9-month period, you will see some gains in skills, but what they wanted to see here is were the gains higher and at a steeper curve within the group that got the intervention. And they also had the parents and teachers fill out various rating scales before and after the intervention on their behavior and language. So the intervention was effective. The group that participated in the intervention showed significantly more improvements in measures of language and literacy. So specifically things like syllable manipulation, letter sound knowledge, these things that are involved in phonological awareness, written letters, word reading, even in their reading ability, non-word reading, and their spelling. So it didn't just improve one small aspect of language. This is actually a pretty big improvement across a wide range of language and literacy skills that they were working on with this therapist. Okay. So really, that is the only language intervention study conducted with a group of children with FASD. It sounds great, the results were fantastic, but as you can see, it was a very big study, and it was 9 months, twice a week with a speech language therapist, and we can't always be doing that in the school system. So we have to kind of look at other interventions that are out there as well that can inform the FASD research, because not every child is going to be able to work with a speech language therapist twice a week for 9 months in this type of setting. It would be great, but it's not always going to work out that way. So if we look at speech and language development, obviously is a problem in a lot of different developmental disorders. There actually is quite a bit of research with other populations doing language intervention. So we can also look at that research and see how we can apply those strategies to children with FASD. And then hopefully, as we're going through this and as research is developing, hopefully there will be more opportunity for researchers to try out some of these other techniques with other populations with FASD. One thing that we haven't talked about so far is the involvement of the parents. So remember that South Africa study, that was with a speech language therapist, somebody that was highly trained, that's going to be expensive to conduct, and it was over 9 months. But what about the parents? What can parents do to improve their children's language? And we do know that language development in children is related to their interactions with their parents. So it's related to the overall amount of interactions they have with their parents, how responsive the parents are to the child's language. So is the parent really engaging in conversation with the child and responding to what the child is saying and repeating things back and asking questions, this whole interaction. Also, when they are interacting, the amount of language input. So interaction can be verbal and nonverbal, but it's also important that the amount of verbal language input in their interactions. And then also various support strategies that parents are using. So things like parents will expand on what their child is saying. Parents will just naturally explain relationships between objects and whatnot. I have a 2.5-year-old right now that's just really learning to speak and starting to talk in sentences. So I find myself daily doing these support strategies. He may say, put cookie or something, and then I'll repeat, put cookie in the cupboard or something like that, expanding on what he's saying to teach him, appropriate sentences and whatnot. And so parents do this all the time, kind of naturally, as your children are learning to speak. So given that parents really are the people that are spending the most time with these children, we need research that's actually going to educate the parents to help improve language skills. And so this whole article was discussing the importance of how it was really important to teach parents how they can help improve their children's language, because they're the frontline people that are actually with their children the most. And so this is based on a triadic model, intervention model, and that just means that a skilled interventionist trains a parent who then works on the language with their children. Okay, so it's not necessarily the child doing these one-on-one sessions with the speech language therapist, which could be very time and labor intensive. The parent actually has the sessions with the speech language therapist. They teach the parent what to do, and the parent takes those skills home, where they have the child 15 hours a day or whatever, where they can work on these things. So it's a really great model. So what Roberts and Kaiser did is they did a meta-analysis on a number of different studies that were conducted that were parent-implemented intervention studies. So they actually found, and they had to be for children that had speech and language impairments, so just general speech and language impairments. Again, this wasn't specific to FASD, it was the broader group of children with language impairments. And so they did a meta-analysis, and in a meta-analysis what you do is you actually take the results of a number of different published studies, and you actually take the results and you reanalyze them all together into one big study, and then come up with some general conclusions from across all of those studies. So it's a great way to really look at replication across studies, and to look at general findings across a number of studies rather than just saying, okay, we have this one study that found this one found this one found this. Let's take them all together, reanalyze the results together, and see what we can say as a whole on, in this case, it was parent-implemented intervention studies. So these meta-analysis studies are very intensive, difficult to do, but they're great when they're published because they provide a lot of knowledge. And so here they actually found 18 studies that met their criteria to be in this meta-analysis. And so across these 18 studies that were parent-implemented intervention studies, the children ranged in age from 18 months to 5 years, and they all had some sort of language impairment. So we're dealing with pretty young children here. So I definitely won't have time to go into all the different interventions that they did, but in general, the intervention strategies that in the different studies were done with the parents, and the parents were doing with the children are the parent responding to the child, so improving their responsiveness to the child, which is really important. Doing turn taking in conversations, so not just the parent speaking, not just the child speaking, you're having a conversation together and you're taking turns. And then just the parents using appropriate language models for their children. So, I mean, if we're not speaking correctly, or we can't expect our children to necessarily have all the correct grammar and whatnot. One program that does stand out across these 18 studies, a lot of the programs did use what was called the Hand-in Parent program. So, and again, it's just a parent program designed to help parents improve their children's language skills. So if people want to do further research from this, they can look at that Hand-in Parent program as well. Not all of them did use that program, though. So in general, the parents had ranging from 9 to 19 sessions with a trained interventionist who trained them, and then the parents worked on it with their children, and it was across 10 to 13 weeks. Okay, so this is, again, these are all ranges because, like I said, there are 18 different studies, so we're looking at it across the studies. In most of the research, the parents met with the interventionist and went over different skills, but some of them they actually had in-home sessions, which is great, where the interventionist came to the home and helped in the home. So what did they find across these 18 studies? Well, they found greatly significant results, really important results. They found that in general, parent-implemented interventions had positive effects on both expressive and receptive language in children. So again, both of these main core aspects of language. And again, these are general findings across all 18 studies. Positive effects for whether or not the children had intellectual disabilities. So remember, all of these children had language impairments. Some of them also had intellectual disabilities, and some of them didn't. So the interventions were just as effective if the children had lower IQs and more overall cognitive deficits, which really leads us to think that this probably could be useful for kids with FASD who also have intellectual difficulties and cognitive impairments and a lot of other things going on. So I really think this parent-implemented interventions can probably speak to a lot of the FASD research, and it would be really important to try out some of these techniques with kids with FASD. So in the studies, they had there were 18 different studies, so they had parents either reporting on their child's language, or the researchers themselves went in and did direct observations to observe how the child's language was doing. So they found positive effects for both of these aspects, which is important because if you actually only see positive effects on the parental report and the parents are the ones doing the interventions, it could be due to possible bias. Of course, the parents want to see their children's language improving, but outside researchers also noticed improvements in the children's language. So it wasn't just the parent report, which is important. And another thing is, yes, it improved language and improved receptive and expressive language. Those are great things. But it also had some positive effects on the parents, that in turn, the parents tended to be more responsive to their children's language and engaging in more conversation, which is really important. So I absolutely loved this meta-analysis, and I think that it was a great study of 18 studies, and I think that I really hope that the FASD research can move in this direction, because I think parents have a lot that they can be doing with the children, and parents are probably already doing a lot, and I think this could have a lot of implications for the FASD research. Okay, so the next study I'm going to review, again, it's a review study, and so looking at the review studies is a lot it's an easier way to make general conclusions about the effectiveness of interventions without, looking at every single individual study, which can be very time consuming. So this study was published by Law et al., and they reviewed 25 speech and language intervention studies. They weren't necessarily always done with a parent, and some were done with an interventionist. So these were a mixed bag of different types of studies, but it was a Cochrane review. And so the Cochrane reviews are regarded as, they're systematic reviews of a number of different studies, and they're regarded as being internationally recognized, the highest standard of review that you can do, and they're published in this Cochrane library. So only the really, really intensive, high-quality reviews actually get published in the Cochrane library and are conducted through this Cochrane. So when it's a Cochrane review, it holds a lot of weight, and that the results are obviously very important, and that the review was done in an appropriate way. So they just have a lot of credibility. So in general, what they did here is they had 25 different studies that met their criteria with children with speech and language difficulties. Again, they had to already be showing speech and language difficulties. So in general, here we're looking at more of the specific aspects of language. They found positive effects for children with phonological and vocabulary difficulties. The results were a little bit more mixed when you're getting into those higher level syntax difficulties, understanding more of the sentence structure and whatnot. And again, because those are higher level language difficulties that may be more difficult to improve upon. So there were mixed results there. They actually found that receptive language interventions were a little bit less effective. So the ones focusing more on the child speaking were the ones that were a little bit more effective, and that kind of makes sense because it's probably a little bit harder to improve the child's overall understanding, but maybe easier to improve their production of the language. Very importantly, the interventions were just as effective if they were administered by a clinician or a trained parent. So this really brings home this important aspect of training parents and having them be really the instructor for their child's language development. So, it doesn't mean that clinicians aren't effective, because the clinicians are very effective, but parents can also be very effective when they're trained by somebody that has a lot of knowledge in this area. And they also saw a lot of benefits in some of the more classroom-based interventions for including peers that don't have language difficulties, because children really learn a lot from their peers. So having children that are modeling the appropriate use of language around them was also really important. So that brings me to the end of the published research out there. I really hope that we can do this presentation again in 5 years, and we'll have 10 or 15 great studies that are published in FASD looking at language interventions. And maybe we can conduct one on the parent-based interventions, because I think they have a lot to offer. So hopefully this research is just taking off in terms of the language interventions for kids with FASD, because like I said, you can see that the language impairments are pretty robust. They're across a lot of different aspects of language. There's not a lot of intervention research out there, but intervention research on other populations is really effective. So we just got to kind of put the two together now. So I'm going to turn it back over to Jackie now to go over some of the strategies that people can be doing now with kids with FASD.
That's our tag. All right. Are there any questions or anything that we need to address in between? Or?
We have a really quiet audience so far today.
Oh.
I encourage anyone to send in your questions, and we will address the presenters with them.
Okay, cool. I just figured I'd check because I thought it was a good opportunity. I think listening to Carmen, it's apparent that we're just figuring things out. And I think maybe one of the conclusions, as she said, is we're right at the beginning here. And hopefully in 5 years, we have some really exciting things to say based on the way we work together. But I also think, there's some exciting preliminary things. We may only have one study, but we do have one that says improvement can happen. And yeah, maybe it's not the most feasible and the kind of study that we could really do practically in schools right now, but it does tell us that change can happen. And when we think about interventions and when we're thinking about strategies, we're often thinking about two different things. And one is, how can we accommodate? How do we work around? How do we support an individual? And the other one is, where can we actually see change? Where can that functioning change for the individual? And one of the things we know, looking at language interventions, both for broader populations, but also based on the very little bit we do know for individuals affected by FASD, is that change can happen. brains can change. So yes, we're dealing with individuals who have a brain injury, and that's going to affect them in very profound and significant ways. And we're going to need to accommodate, and we're going to need to look for how to make a good fit. But it doesn't mean that we also can't look at interventions that will actually improve the underlying skill sets. Now, what that's going to look like, are we going to have more success with younger kids? Are we going to have more success with more concrete aspects of language, the expressive, how I say things? Maybe. That's kind of what some of the preliminary information is. You'll see that the majority of research that's done into language is with younger children. We think about language a lot with younger children. We're talking about what's happening in those preschool years, language formation years, and a lot of research into that. Even when we look at speech language services in the community, we know that there's way more services provided in those preschool years. The older the kids get, the harder it is to access those services, right? And yet, what do we know from what Carmen said? That the higher level the language gets with an individual affected by FASD, the greater the problems get. So even when they can get the concrete and we see some of the basics in place, once we get into those higher level meaning-making, abstract kind of pieces, we see much greater difficulty. And those are the pieces that have huge impacts on peer interactions. As an adolescent, when you're a teenager, if you're not getting the subtleties of language, if you don't understand sarcasm, wow, that can have huge implications, big implications. And so when we think about language, it's a huge, big topic. And I mean, obviously language has huge implications around education and schooling as well as social functioning. So it impacts a lot of different areas. So it's a long way to go, which is why we need to kind of talk to folks and say, what's working, what are we doing? The exciting thing is, there is evidence that particularly at a young age, we can see change and we can see some improvement. So we can improve basic functioning, we can see something happen there. That's exciting. What is that going to mean functionally? I don't know yet. You guys might know better than I do right now, but we're going to figure that out. We also know that we can accommodate things and we can look at how do we support, because as I said earlier, when you're struggling with language difficulties, it's going to create a lot of domino effects, ripple effects. I don't understand, therefore I'm getting frustrated, therefore my behavior is impacted. I can't communicate well, so I have greater problems with social interactions. We see a lot of those ripple effects. And so we also have to think about interventions that are accommodating and supporting kids across the board in those respects. And so that's what we'll speak to a little bit today, but knowing that we're doing sort of tip of the iceberg work here, which is why it's going to be really important that this is an open line of communication and a back and forth. So I think the first thing that is important, and this is where Carmen started, and even when we talked about our INVEST model, we said first thing we got to do is identify, right? We have to understand what we're dealing with. So first we have to think about language and how it impacts lives and what does it mean for people. Because understanding and changing our way of thinking is sometimes half the battle, or at least some portion of it. If I understand that Sam is frustrated, not because Sam is a bad child and not because Sam doesn't care about me or wants to be angry, but Sam is just frustrated because he doesn't understand and it's a language issue, I'm going to think about Sam differently. I'm going to approach Sam differently. I may talk to Sam differently. So to some degree, beginning by saying, how does language impact our lives? And how can I better understand the individual I'm working with based on a knowledge of language? So we have to change sort of where we're starting from. And I think that changes some of those basic assumptions we're making, and I think that, shifts us a little bit. So I think if you kind of walk away and say, what did I get from this presentation? Number one is we have to challenge our basic thinking and say, how much is language the root of some of the problems we're seeing? How much is language the root of some of the behavioral issues that I'm seeing? If you walk away with that question and start looking at kids and go, how much is language the root of this problem as a result of today, you're already intervening. That's start of an intervention. Right there, you're taking an action because you're changing the way you're thinking about that child, which is going to change the way you respond to that child, and change is what intervention is all about. If we change the way we respond to a child, they're going to change the way they respond to us. That's change and that's intervention. So start with where we are with our first perspective, and you've already done something. So how language impacts lives. Communication with anyone, peers, superiors. As we get older, if we're talking about adulthood, we can jump all the way up there. Job sites, people I'm employers, all across the board, parents, siblings, you name it, communication. We do not know how much we rely on communication until it's a problem. When it works well, great. When it doesn't, the wheels fall off. Stop for a minute and think about how important communication is in your day-to-day. Nonverbal, verbal, otherwise. Communication is huge. Right now, I look at people, I see nods, I see smiles, there's communication. This is helpful. I know where to go, I know what to say. Communication is crucial. When you struggle with that, it's going to impact your life profoundly. Task completion, following directions. Never finish anything. They're clearly unmotivated. This child is not motivated to do anything. Well, what if they just simply didn't understand beyond step 1 of the tasks? You gave them 4 steps, they barely understood 1. So let's say you're learning a new language. Let's say you're just learning Spanish, and I give you 4 steps. You're focusing so hard on understanding step 1. You're like, okay, what was that word again? What was the word for this? Okay, it was that. Okay, I got step 1. Okay, I totally missed 2, 3, and 4. Where did those go? So I can do 1 because I worked so hard and devoted so much mental energy to remembering what those things meant and putting it together and understanding. I got through 1. 2, 3, and 4 are gone. Oh, you didn't finish. You're clearly not motivated. Wait a minute. I put more effort into that than anyone else here. It took more effort for me to even get there, and now you're telling me I'm unmotivated? I'm frustrated. Who wouldn't be? That's a frustrating experience. I'm not even going to try. Forget, I don't even want to listen to step 1 anymore because I put all that in and all I get is you didn't even finish the task. So task completion and following directions can be really challenging. It can look like inattention. You're not paying attention. You're tuning out. No, I'm not tuning out. I'm actually just tuning in and trying to find where those words are. I'm in my inner head trying to think about it, and yeah, I'm missing step 2, 3, and 4, but that's because I haven't even got my head around number 1. And if I do have additional attention problems, well, that's just insult to injury. But language alone can look like inattention because it's so hard for me to get my head around these things. Learning new responses. How do I learn new things to say? I have to understand what's going in, I have to get it in, and then I have to express that again. And as Carmen indicated, when we have difficulty both with receptive understanding language and expressing language, how do I learn how to respond appropriately in a situation? What does that look like? How do I comply with a request? That's like following directions. How do I do what I'm told if I don't fully understand what I'm told? Or maybe it takes me way longer. Okay, Sam, I want you to do this and go there. Okay, so Sam's sitting at his desk. Okay, I have to do this. Doing this okay, I got it. Meanwhile, somebody's going, come on, Sam, why aren't you doing it right now? It's taking me longer. So even if I'm trying to comply with a request, it may take me 2 or 3 times as long because I have to process the language. And if I have troubles with attention to boot, well, then I might get halfway through processing and lose it because that's just really, really, really hard work. Academic performance can be significantly impacted, right? How much of academics is language-based? Much of it, right? Much of it. Peer relationships, I've mentioned that before. Social interactions, jokes, sarcasm. Peer interactions are really, in a lot of ways, particularly in adolescence, they get into quite a level of sophistication. They don't necessarily have a lot of grammatic structure, so the structures that Carmen was talking about may not be there, but there's a fair bit of sophistication and higher level. There's a lot of innuendo, things like that, right? What I say and what I mean, not the same thing. I use my tone, I subtly change it. But if you have trouble with language, I think that what you say is what you mean. Like, I think it's direct, but really it's not. So if I say, yeah, man, we should never do that again, and I mean the opposite, you're going this way because you think they actually literally meant what they said. So really, peer interactions and relationships can be really affected. Confidence and frustration. If every time you open your mouth, people laugh or you say it wrong, wow, how often are you going to feel comfortable speaking up? You're going to be frustrated. How many of us keep going back to things we feel we're bad at? How many of us, right? We do things, we go to things. I go to a dance class, I do a few things, I fall on my face, I'm pretty embarrassed. I stop showing up. I go, you know what, maybe dance is not really the kind of thing I should be doing. Maybe my strengths aren't there. I don't go anymore because you know what, it's embarrassing, it's hard, and I've got bruises. So my confidence is impacted, I'm frustrated, doesn't work. If you're in school and that's your whole world, pretty soon you're looking for something else to do. I would be. That's just smart. So Language impacts lives. These kinds of things, if we start with this, if you say, like I said, what's my take-home message today, and I only gave you one, this would be it. Think about these pieces with the individuals you're interacting with. Ask yourself, in what way are these pieces affecting their ability to function? Go back to our INVEST model, and when you're identifying and thinking about how I can identify and set some goals for an individual, think about how is language impacting them, and how can I set a goal for this individual that reflects an appreciation of the challenge they're having. So maybe I need to shift away from language or give them opportunities for success and confidence outside of language-based tasks. How would I do that? What would that look like? That's how I'm shifting my thinking. A few other strategies to start accommodating and things. And some of these are things based on what we know from research. Some of these are things that I've pulled together, and this is why we always invite feedback and suggestion. There's some basic things around language that are really good. Get full attention before communicating. Use subtle strategies. These are great classroom things. Teachers do this all the time. You guys know us. You want to be looking at codes or things you can use to make sure that you've connected with a child before you're talking. Remembering if language is challenging for a youth or a child, language will be exhausting. It's very, very tiring to engage in tasks that are really hard, right? If I started talking calculus right now, okay, I can't talk calculus, but if I pretended I knew calculus, it would invest a lot of energy, and I could probably talk about it for 5 minutes, and I'd be like, okay, I need a break. Can we have a timeout? Because it's too much work, and my brain would be blowing something. So if we think that language is like that, I've got a child in my classroom, and every time I'm talking, they're going, like they're blowing engines here because they're working so hard. So I may actually have something I really want them to hear, and I know that they're going to be tuning out a bit. I know they are because they have to. That's like taking care of themselves. That's protective. But there's something they do need to hear. So I'm going to walk over, I'm going to give them a code, or I'm going to tap, or I'm going to whatever. Sometimes I've suggested to others, you can even make it fun, especially with the young kids, right? Where they become your secret spy. And so you have your spy code. And whenever you do the secret spy message, they know that there's some really important information coming. And so they tune in for a minute. Because we know we need them tuned in for a very specific piece of information. Because we recognize that they're not going to catch everything. And we recognize that when it comes to certain instructions, if there's something they really need, let's give them the spy code and see if we can bring them in and have their attention and know that they're engaged for that moment and they're getting that piece. That can help. That can help a little bit, particularly around some of the structures and directions that will come, say, in a classroom or a home environment. Allowing extra time for responses. Their brain is working twice as hard. It's running it through, right? Around language and communication, we know that sometimes when we're dealing with language problems, we're looking at brain pathways that are not as efficient. It's kind of like, imagine the brain is made up of a lot of roads. Anyone that's heard me, I talk about roads all the time and things. And we've got a lot of roads. And most of us, we're trying to get a message from Edmonton to Calgary, and we hop on Highway 2, and it's a nice paved road with many lanes, and we move really fast, right? That communication moves quickly, relatively speaking. Some of us move too fast. But anyway, we're moving fast. A lot of these kids with an FASD, their brain is not connected in the same way. So when they're going from Edmonton to Calgary, they got only one lane, and it's gravel. Guess what? That's going to go slower. I'm going to get to Calgary way faster than they are. They're bumping over roads, they're going there. So you know what? We got to wait. We don't just get to Calgary and go, where are you, where are you, where are you? We go, no, you know what? They're on a gravel road. It's going to take them a little while. I'm going to be patient. Let's give them the time they need to get there. That's what's happening in the brain. Messages are taking longer to move because those pathways are not paved in the same way as others might be. Sometimes they're going to get there really quick, and sometimes they're not. And so it depends on which pathway they're on, which road they're taking. Maybe they take two-way and it's paved, so they're okay. So know that sometimes they're going to need extra time for responses, and that really is brain. Use short, simple directives when speaking. Keep things short. If language is hard and you're rambling on like I am right now, it's going to be hard. We want to keep it nice and short and simple. Basic words, as concrete as we can. Ooh, looking for the arrow. There we go. Oh, hey, look at that. Be concrete. Support with visual cues. If the kids like visual things, visual is helpful. I think I say this later, but I'll say it now just in case. Sometimes even with language, it's really nice to find out what kids like and what kids are good at. You know what their interest is? And then you may find that certain learning or certain messages can be attached to those as analogies. So if they really like hockey and you're trying to explain something, they know hockey. Hockey makes sense for them maybe. They've watched it. And you could describe things according to hockey. So you can say, well, it's kind of like you're passing the puck now. We need to do this. Or it's like when we go to math, we're changing shifts. So, you know, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about hockey. So instead of saying it's time to put away your English and go to math, it's like, all right, we're shifting, you know, it's time to shift. Or we're between periods here. So end of the period, time to go on to the next, you know, let's all head to the locker room. Again, sounds silly, but what we're doing is we're putting it into meaningful things that work for them, and we're taking the language load off and giving them a bit of a context meeting. That's a visual. They can go, oh yeah, that's what they do. They all leave the ice and they go do something. Oh, okay, I can leave the room and go do something else. Again, and you know what? You're going to feel these out and work them because they're going to be very different for different kids. We know there's a lot of diversity. Some kids totally wouldn't work. So, you know, they're not all or none strategies. Check for understanding. Restating is not understanding. So sometimes what we'll find is I'll say, you know, did you understand this? And they'll say, yes, Ottawa is the capital of Canada. Okay, great, great. Well, what does it mean for Ottawa to be the capital of Canada? Ottawa is the capital of Canada. Okay, good. What does it mean to be a capital? Well, Ottawa is the capital of Canada. Okay, you don't know what you're saying. You're repeating this, you're telling me this information, but the true understanding of that is not there. And so what we need to do is check for understanding if it's something, okay, well, what would it mean for something to be a capital? What is that? Oh, it's where government is, or things like that. We need a little bit more. What does government do? So asking those questions, simply giving them ways to make sense of it in their world, but always checking for that understanding. Again, we're challenging our own thinking and our assumptions here. This is as much about us sometimes as it is about the kids that we're working with. Because if we go, oh, they understand that, and depending on what that is, we'll go, oh, they get it. And then we get to a test and they don't explain it, or we get to a real life situation where we expect them to act on certain information and they don't do it. And we're like, but you said it. You're not doing what you said. Well, if you don't really understand it, you can't act on what you said. If you said, I know that this is the way things are supposed to go, I know these are the rules, but I don't really understand what that means, I'm not going to act that way, but I'll sound really good. So we check that. Quantity of speech is not the same as quality of speech, and this may be quite meaningful for many of you. So just because somebody can say a lot, I could be evidence of that, I'm not sure, but just because somebody can say a lot doesn't mean that there is a lot of quality. And you know, you think of a teacher in a classroom, you're surrounded by these 30 kids and they're all la 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 la, and a lot of times when I work with a teacher, they'll say, how is their language? They'll be like, oh, their language is great, it's great. And I'll be like, oh, so they're nonstop, they're, you know, chatterbugs, and they chatter my ear off. And I'll say, okay, cool. So when I talk to you next, come back to me and let me know one story they've told me. Give me one story or something, you know, ask them for a story of their week, and then come back and tell me what it was. I'm curious about that. And they'll come back to me and they'll go, okay, I can't tell you a story. I tried to get a story out of them, but it kind of jumped around and it didn't actually make sense. And they're perplexed. They're like, but they talk all the time. And I said, yeah, but once we start to look at what the quality of the talking is, that's where our understanding comes. And that's where, again, back to that shift perspective, back to kind of where we see things a little differently. Lots of words, lots of volume, sometimes, for some kids. But is it hanging together? Is it pulling together? If we know it's not, then we're going to change our expectations. We're going to stop asking for long stories, and we might start asking for single details, right? We're going to stop saying, you know, we need this long, expanded thing, and I want to hear a detail and a detail and a detail. We become a little bit more directive. We start guiding language more. And that's okay. Supporting engagement and learning, one step at a time. I've talked about that a little bit. Reminders may be needed, visual cues, we've talked a little bit about that. Reminders are really important, and I always like to say that keeping reminders very proactive and supportive. So not, oh man, you're off task again, get back on task. More the supportive reminders, looking at ways to make it more of a support arrangement. Anticipate the fact that kids are going to get off task because it's tiring and there's a number of factors that are impacting them. So what do? We be proactive. We anticipate. Yeah, I'm going to have to do this, so how do we make it something that's a little bit more positive and not always punitive? Because if it's always punitive, they're always in trouble, wow, who wants to be there? It's hard enough that I have to work hard, let alone I'm always in trouble. I talked about visual analogies. I knew I had that later on, but anyway, I jumped the gun on that one. Finding a balance between shorter tasks and providing more time for tasks. So this is an interesting one because I think balance is really important. A lot of times we'll say when we're dealing with language, and I said it even earlier, provide more time for responses, provide more time for these kinds of things, which is really important because processing can take a bit more time. However, there does need to be a bit of balance there. Because if we give too much time, it simply becomes frustrating. So that's a little bit of play it by ear, know your kid, know what's going on. There's a certain amount of time that we want to give extra time, but if I'm doing something for so long, I'm actually just kind of burning out. And so I need to know when I can say, you know, maybe I need to shorten a task and not just give more time. So if I've got a writing assignment, I may need to simply shorten that writing assignment and give a little bit more time instead of keeping it the same length of assignment and going for twice as much time, because they just don't have the ability to do it through all that task. And I see we've got a question.
Yeah, we have a question from an audience member who's wondering if that some students need confidence to get up and answer questions and put up their hand. So should we repeat their sentence if a class does not understand?
Absolutely. I have no problem with that repeating. I think repeating can be great. And I think it's something you could always build in. And sometimes when I'm repeating a sentence or repeating something, I don't go, oh, class, this is what they meant. No, I say, so for instance, here you're saying, you know, do I repeat something? So I might say, oh, class, did you hear? Yeah, if we were to repeat something, just like Johnny here said, that's a great idea. So I've repeated it to ensure clarity, but I've done it not in a kind of embarrassing, oh, in case you didn't understand, Johnny just said this. No, 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 I'm saying, right, Johnny, great idea. If we do this, and now I'm repeating it, right? Or, oh, Johnny, that's a great question. We should think about why do we put the two numbers over top of the two numbers like that? That's a really good question, Johnny. So I've repeated that. And in fact, it's not a bad thing. We can do that with other kids as well periodically, because it's always good to repeat questions to make sure everybody's on the same page. So I think it's a really good way to do it. It also does some of what Carmen was talking about in the research in terms of that modeling. It models a certain clarity, so that's good for this child to hear what they intended to say repeated in a proper way. So they're getting nice modeling there in terms of actually thinking their language development. They're also getting nice positive support, and we can make it a real confidence build. So what we're saying is, oh, that's a good idea. Oh, thanks, Johnny, for that idea. Really with those positive responses and reframing it and bring it back to the class that way. So I think it's a great idea. I think you can build so many things into repeating a question. Just thinking about how we do it is what's important. So that's a fantastic question and a really good strategy to use to ensure that and build that confidence, because kids will feel great then, especially the youngers, right? As soon as you said they did something good, ooh, all their hands go up, right? They all want to be acknowledged by the teacher for their brilliance. Certainly as they get older, less so, but then we usually have less things going on. But absolutely. Finally, another point here is talking about you seeking opportunities to use technology. You know, we're in a changing world, and I'm really careful when I start talking about technology because this is not my strong suit. But we are in a changing world, and within education and also home environments, we're seeing increased opportunities to access technology as supports for our learning and our understanding. And exploring the way in which those technologies can support a child in their learning and their language learning can be great. So for some kids and some situations, things like we discussed in the beginning, an audio accompaniment to something they're reading can be valuable. Other kids, it's too much. It's coming in here, it's going in here. Whoa, make it stop. I can't handle it. But for some, it's great because they can hear it and it will make more sense and they don't get hung up on things like decoding individual words, right? Decoding means like sounding words out. So if you can't sound out a word, if it doesn't make sense phonetically, but you hear it, you'll recognize it, that can sometimes help get you past a little bit. There's other technologies where if somebody writes something down, it can read it back. So if a particular child is identified as having a strength, more of a strength in understanding than they can in putting things on paper, we can support with those kinds of feedback. And I know these kinds of technologies are emerging, but they're there and they're nice accommodations and they're things that we can look at. They're not going to solve our problems necessarily. It's not, you know, like technology is a magic pill or anything, but it's great to know that they're there, and it's great that we can consider how they might be used as resources for our kids. And I mean, really, as Carmen said, there's so much room for more research and more things that we can be doing, and I think this is one area that we might see it, and that I'm really excited because I have heard back from teachers a fair bit around technologies and what's working, what's not, and I like to hear more and more about that because it's a changing world, and every year there's something new out there. So, and things like iPads have become quite popular with a number of different populations in terms of using them because of the way that they can create different means of communication. So how can we use these? What does it work like? I don't know. Is it feasible? Big questions. How can we make this effective in a classroom? Big questions. I don't know the answer, but I do think that they're really interesting questions and things that we want to keep exploring, and that, you know, we go back to our INVEST model. Some of you folks may have already been exploring, so track it, write it down, let me know. As I said before, language skills can improve. We talk about accommodation, we can support it, but we can also see improvement. So know that we can think both in terms of change skills as well as support skills, right? Brains change. Our brains change all the time. If you're sitting here listening to this presentation, if there's any new piece of information that you've got today, hopefully there's something new that you've learned today, your brain changed. There you go, done, just like that, right? Our brains are changing and evolving all the time. Kids with an FASD are no different. Their brains are changing, they're evolving, we can work with that. Language skills can improve. So we want to look at improvement and support. We want to do both. Starting with basics, we do know that where we are seeing improvements is largely with the basics, and that's most of the language research, that's most of what we're looking at, and there's nothing wrong with that. If we start with basics and go back to basic phonetics, awareness of letters and language, especially working with the younger kids, great. Let's keep that in mind and look at the supports that we can provide in those early years of schooling. And as the study that we saw that Carmen spoke to, they're looking at 9-year-old kids. So these are older, I mean, we're talking kind of grade 2, 3, maybe even into grade 4, depending on when they start. You know, these ages where we're still seeing improvements, brain changing with regards to their ability to read and understand what they're reading because of the improvement in some of these basic skills. And that's kids with an FASD. That's great. That means in elementary, we could be doing things. Now, as Carmen said, what's the feasibility of an SLP working twice a week with these kids? Okay, maybe not so much. But it doesn't mean that there isn't, you know, we have found things that look like they could be effective. So that's exciting. Oh, we have another question. That's great.
Yeah, we do. We have a couple questions actually about.
Yay.
Oh, we have a whole long list. Don't worry. But these are about technology and wondering what research there is to support the use of technology, especially in order to get funding for technology.
Yeah.
And also on kind of the other side of it, when does too much technology become a problem for everyday language?
That's a great question.
I'd just like to add my
Please.
own question
Yeah,
to
do.
that as what might be some of the risks associated with the use of social media, particularly for adolescents, if they have language challenges?
Oh, so you mean you're talking about like things like Facebook?
Yeah, and Twitter and
okay.
all that stuff.
Whoa, we're opening up cans of worms today. That's great. Okay, I love it. Well, let's first start with technology. In terms of FASD, as you know, there's no research that looks at that at all, and very little looking at language. Most of the research that's looking at technology are looking with very specific populations. There have definitely been studies out there that have looked at how we can use technology to support specific populations in terms of using as basic communication or different functional kinds of devices. Well, we have nothing with regards to FASD. I think, and you know, at the university, actually, we have a technology area right now that's really looking at this, because there are also some studies that are coming out that are kind of mixed. And they're also saying things like, you know what, it's not like the golden egg, like all of a sudden we found this and it's going to solve problems. So it does become a case of, it's another tool in our toolbox of many, many things. So how well it's going to work and what are the limitations is going to vary a little bit depending on the technology and the child and the context. But it's definitely not the golden egg, and there are pros and cons, and I think it depends on what you're trying to do with it. I am no technology expert. I'm not going to begin to jump into that in any way, but I do think it's something that really warrants closer inquiry, and there are people starting to do it on a much more general basis, looking at technology in academia and what does it look like. Can you have too much, I think was one of the questions, or the add-on question to that. Absolutely. Oh, we can inundate kids with, and what a distraction that is. If I've got this support and that support, we have to kind of pick and choose. And even if we go back to INVEST and we're talking about identifying what we want to change and looking at goals, we need to be specific and we need to be focused. Sometimes we want to change everything because these kids have a lot of issues. There's a lot of difficulties that they're challenged by. And we want it all to be better, and we want it all better now. And so we say, okay, well, let's give them this for this and this for this, and this will help with this and this will help with this. Wow, that's a lot. That's a lot for them to manage. I'm really a fan of keeping it a little simple, streamlined, find something that works, use it, add to it if you need to. The more they have, the more confusing it's getting. All of a sudden, we're asking them to organize and sort through things. Less is more, I tend to find. But again, I've got no research to support me. That's just speaking from experience and people I've talked to. So I think it's a less is more kind of thing. Now, Jean asked about social media and Facebook. Oh, well, yeah, there's a number of issues. I mean, that's like a little research mecca for a lot of people right now. Let me tell you, there's a lot of inquiry going into that because we're seeing such a change in the way that kids and adolescents now are communicating and the way social networks are established. And, you know, what's really interesting is that when we're dealing, you know, one of the things we know about kids affected by FASD is to a certain extent, their visual skills are often a little bit stronger. So the ability to use the visuals are sometimes a little stronger. And so the visual, the hands-on, the in-person skills might be a little bit stronger. So when you suddenly jump into a social media, and there's no research about this yet. I've seen nothing even remotely close to this, but this is Jackie's speculation as well as some of the individuals I've worked with. So others may have had other experiences. But what happens when they start to use the social media is you get none of that visual. It's all text-based. It's all language-based. So all the subtlety, innuendo, and things that even, you know, they struggle with in person, but maybe there's a bit of a visual cue that helps to kind of control or rein it in or give them feedback, are all gone, right? All of the social cues are absent. The audience is enormous. And I think the problems also are additional to language-based, because once we start talking about social media, we get into some issues, particularly in adolescent, that relate to some of their executive functions and these issues of judgment and understanding cause and effect, and even understanding that the picture I put in Facebook goes to everybody, and the fact that I don't put any privacy settings on my Facebook page because it didn't think that I should, means that not only did that picture I put into Facebook go to everyone, it goes to anybody in the world. Like, I have no privacy settings. So, you know, the level of appropriateness of information that's communicated, boundaries. So the language is part of what the issue perhaps with that social media, but I think that the issues go well beyond that. And I have significant concerns around protection of our youth in terms of how they use these. And certainly we also know that there's a lot of concerns around things like cyberbullying and the way that social media is used to exert pressures. It's a little bit of unknown territory still. And the challenge too is for many of us, speaking for myself in particular, this is new territory too. And so we knew what it was like to grow up and build social networks. And so the idea of building them on the internet is very bizarre and foreign to us. And so trying to understand where the strengths are and where the values might be in those social networking opportunities and where the risks and the pitfalls are is also a challenge. I don't think everything is all horrible, but I think it's a language that we don't speak particularly well. So here we are in the research world and we're trying to understand what they're doing as 16-year-olds when their experience is radically different than what mine was at 16. So how do I even figure that out? But we do know that there are a lot of dangers associated with it because of some of the things that we've seen happen. We've seen that, and a lot of us have, and I'm sure many people have stories. So, but I do think it goes even beyond the language issues. Good? Mm-hmm. Awesome. Okay, I'll wrap up. I'm just about through this, and then if there are other questions, we can come back to that. So we want to start with basics, working with interests. I talked about that a little bit. Looking at how we can bring topics of interest into areas of learning, build on existing knowledge. All of our memories, all of our understandings work better when we can elaborate, when we can work within a context. Understanding that an individual affected by FASD, they still learn things, they still understand things, they still have contexts and things that they fully understand. We just need to find what those are and then work within them a little bit when we can. That can be helpful. Music, games, things like that can be helpful for practicing language and using language. Music can be a wonderful way to communicate, and sometimes, you know, moving into some more artistic endeavors can be a really lovely way for kids affected with an FASD to communicate. There's more than one way besides words. Picture really can paint 1,000, you know, what is it, picture says 1,000 words? Yeah, I'm messing up my metaphors now and my students, but it's true. And so can we create other ways for kids to express themselves? Can we look at assignments in school that allow for visual means of expression, not just verbal means of expression? and tap into some of these alternative strengths. Music, again, I put in there as a nice one. You know, I've worked with some kids who've done some really cool things around rap songs or other kinds of music that they create as a means by which to express themselves. And that way they don't have to get bound by the language constraints, and they can do as much with the rhythm and the movement of the music to express themselves, which becomes very physical and very visceral as opposed to being bound by what's going on in here. They can respond to those systems that are really working for them, and that can build confidence and also effective communication. And I can understand what's going on for them. So where possible, what can we build in terms of alternatives? How can we be a little bit creative in the way we give these kids opportunities to express? Because just because language is impaired doesn't mean there aren't other things going on that we want to capture and give them a means to express. Peer supports. Carmen mentioned that peer supports can be successful, and that's a great one to look at, particularly through the elementary years. Doing peer supports and buddy systems and things around language, kids respond to that. If you've got kids with an FASD and they're in kindergarten, grade 1, and you can buddy them with a grade 6er who's got some really good language, oh, come on, that's cool. At grade 1, you're still okay with that, right? And it's my grade 6 buddy. And if they're the one kind of modeling language and helping with language a little bit, cool. It's still okay at those young grades. We can really work with those and really work with tasks that the two are doing that are a little bit more language specific, right? Let's just focus it. Let's just be thoughtful and intentional in the way those peer mentoring relationships are set up in the schools. Interventions can be directed. We can look into how we can involve speech-language pathologists. There are other work that looks out and says that, you know, even speech-language pathologists can sometimes be great classroom consultants, talking to teachers and schools a little bit in terms of strategies to be used at a classroom level. I was reading one review, which we didn't want to review for you folks today, but they were talking about the difference between a speech-language pathologist working individually with a child as opposed to working with a teacher to work with a classroom, and found some successes in both things. And actually what they concluded was that we don't know which is better. They actually said, we don't know. We see improvements in both ways. We're not sure that there's one is better than the other. Well, that's exciting, because when we start talking about feasibility of things, if we can have a teacher who works with an SLP who then works with a class, we get more bang for our buck, so to speak, than if we have to do all pullouts. We can build, and then that teacher doesn't need to keep working. They can continue to apply that skill as the years go by. So that will hopefully improve our capacity. Now what? Now where do we go? We want to know more about intervention. We need more information. Carmen said that. I've said that. We've talked about that. We want to know about all the things that are currently going on. What are the impacts that are out there right now? People are doing things. We know that. What are they? How do we know what's happening? How do we capture some of that, and how do we share that information? That's kind of where I started today, and that's where, you know, we come back to, because we do need to start sharing and communicating and figuring out how we can do that. How do we bring this information together and making it meaningful? How do we take things that we might find in a research setting and really put it in a position where it's useful and practical for people in day-to-day? How do we do that? That's something that Carmen and I wrestle with. How do we make sure that what we're doing becomes functional and useful for folks? And how do we take what people are doing and take it into a research world where we can then make sure that everybody knows about it and we can support it and speak to it? So how do we move that information? These are some of the big questions that we're asking. How do we do that? And how do we do it in a way that makes sense? And we're not the only ones that we want to have this conversation with. So that's why we're having it right now with all of you, so that you guys can start having that conversation as well, thinking, how do we start communicating? How do we capture this information? And how do we capture it in a way that becomes a little bit more tangible? Because it's not enough to say, I'm doing this intervention, I think it works because it feels good. It may feel good. I get that. I've been there. But that's not enough, because that's not what somebody who pays the bills or writes the policies is going to look at. They want to know numbers. They want to know how do you know. They want to know these things. It's a pain sometimes, but they do. So you know what? We're here to support that, but you folks are also, you know, how do we partner up to make sure that information gets where it needs to go? Other things we could do: keeping informed, seeking out these kind of learning opportunities, communication opportunities, looking for partnerships, ways we can work together, ways we can talk together, ways we can start linking the way we're thinking. Asking questions. I always say, don't be satisfied with the status quo. I think we're doing great work, and I think we have really motivated people, but I'm not satisfied. We've got a long way to go. Carmen said, let's see what happens in 5 years, and then let's see what happens in 10 and 15, right? We're at a beginning place right now, and that's kind of exciting, but it's also a lot of work. So Let's not be satisfied, and let's keep moving forward, and let's do it together. It's not on one person's shoulders here. See the potential. There's tremendous potential here. We can have change. We can impact lives. These interventions can work. Even as we're sort of scrabbling right now, you know what? We're in the very early stages. If you're frustrated and you're going, nothing's working, this is so hard, that's okay. We're in early stages. This is really brand new stuff. Like Carmen said, there's one study. We're brand new, folks. This is cutting edge. So it's going to be hard. We're going to get frustrated. We're going to feel sometimes like it's a black hole and there's nowhere to go. That's why we need to work together, because you know what? There is potential. There are successes. I've heard the stories. They're out there. We need to capture those successes, capitalize on them, and share them, because we can have success, we can make progress, and we can do things. So yes, we're challenged, and I don't want to, minimize that, but I do want to say we keep going. I'll be shameless, and I just want to let everyone know that we also have some means of communication, and one of those things is through the Intervention Network Action Team with the Canada FASD Research Network. See, I've got old heading up here. I'm sure Denise is looking at it going, oh, Jackie, you didn't update your heading. I do in my new stuff. But what we do is we put out an electronic newsletter where we try to communicate with folks about what's going on in terms of ongoing interventions, collaboration opportunities. We also have a blog site, and we are welcome to go to that blog site. We say, put on some information. What are you doing? What's working? What are your questions? People are busy, I get that. We don't have tons of time to do all these things. But we're trying to do the best we can to increase our systems of communication. How do we start talking with one another? How do we start transferring information? It's hard when we're as busy as we are, but this is one way that we're trying to do it. So if these are things that you're interested in, you're welcome to email me. You can go to the Canada FASD Research Network website, where you can find links to us. We can get you onto the website. We can get you onto the blog. Let me know, and like I said, our contact information is there, so I'm more than happy to make sure that you're provided with our newsletter, which can also help link you to our blog site and all those things. So those are things that we're doing to help facilitate what I'm saying today in terms of how can we work together to really invest in intervention. There we go. I'm like, whew. All right, questions? Are there that you're like, oh yeah.
We have a few individuals who are voicing their own frustration trying to work with schools to support their children especially. So finding that they're able to create a safe place in their own home for their kids.
Oh, wonderful.
But wondering how they can support the school in creating a positive place for that child there.
Absolutely. And that can be a real challenge. And it's something that we're really working on. Or how can we really work towards nice partnerships and collaborations between home and school? And how can we start bridging that? And, Alberta Education has been doing a lot of work in this area lately, looking at how we can increase that partnership and how we can do that, because in the real world, sometimes there's just real challenges, and schools are trying to figure out how to meet those needs, and we, go teacher by teacher, principal by principal, and we're dealing with some really different scenarios. Trying to collaborate, opening a conversation with the schools, I think is crucial, and I realize that's sometimes really well received, and other times it's more challenging, just depending on who the people are that you're working with in that given system. I think one of the things that we need to do when we're working with a school is not just go in and say, you need to do this with my child, because sometimes that's hard for them to do within that school environment. Rather, say, this is what's working at home. What do you have available at your school? How can we come together and find something that works together? So as opposed to going in and saying, hey, I'm going to tell you how to do it, school, because you know what, school's got a lot of demands they're meeting too, and they're wrestling with things, and so, and I know I'm speaking ideal world, so whoever asked that question might say, I've tried this and it's not working, and I'm sorry if that's the case, because I do think sometimes we're just dealing with people, and when we're dealing with people, we're dealing with challenges. But I think that when we go in and we invite conversations, and we say, this is what's really working at home, how can we bring some of this into the school? What would work? How can I support what's happening at the school? What do you have available at the school? What makes sense for you in your school? So that we show a bit of reciprocal respect. right? And the same goes the other way. When a school is something really good going on, sometimes the school gets frustrated because they go, whoa, we're having trouble working with the family, right? And similarly, it's, okay, this is what's working in the school. How do we invite a family into that conversation without saying, you need to do this. This is right, this is wrong, I'm right, you're wrong. And say, no, let's invite a conversation and say, this is what's working for you, and how can we bring these things together? In what ways can we bring these things together? So sometimes it's a matter of how we're broaching it. Because you know what, when we're all working hard and we're all frustrated, we all get a little bit sensitive. And that's normal, and that's the way we work, and particularly when we feel overworked and challenged. So when, you know, if a parent walks in and says, oh, you know, I'm really frustrated, this isn't happening, and they're authentic and they're feeling it, but the school's kind of hearing, because they're sensitive, you know, you're doing it all wrong and you guys are horrible, because that's what they hear, even if that's not what the parent is saying. And then they get a little defensive, and it's really quick for us to get into those things, even though the intentions can always be good, right? Both people might want the best thing, but we get off on the wrong foot. And so I think when we go in thinking, okay, how do I sort of invite this? Even though I'm frustrated like crazy, even though this person's driving me nuts, my goal is that we need to try to find a way to work together. So how can I start a conversation with this person that will be about finding, you know, sharing a common goal, as opposed to my way, their way, I'm right, you're wrong, those kind of things. I offer that up as a way to work with schools, and vice versa, because I think this could be easily asked by a teacher who expresses the same thing, because I've heard it both ways. I think we're learning. I think we're still learning. I think the involvement of parents in schools and the collaborations between home and schools and other professionals is also evolving. You know, along with all these interventions and how we all work together, we're learning how to do it well. We're learning how to do it in a meaningful way. And so I think that it's not an easy answer, and it sounds a little Pollyannish, and I get that, but I also think it's real. I think that when we go in and we're open to conversation and we have shared goals, and we stop from saying this is the way, and more invite sort of feedback about what do you have, what's available to you, and how can we work together, we get better response. So that would be my suggestion, is thinking about the ways that we ask those questions. Yeah, that would be my 2 bits. And I keep looking at Colleen, who's here in the room with me, because she does some work in this area in terms of Alberta education and collaboration. And certainly Alberta education does have a number of resources available online that look at how collaboration takes place, and particularly with parents and teachers. And so there's some lovely video resources that are available online through Alberta Education that look at collaborating with parents and educators, and start saying, how do we do this? So these are questions that they're asking and that they're exploring right now quite a bit. So again, we're cutting edge.
On the flip side, as you were saying, of schools and teachers working with parents, do you have any specific strategies that you can suggest for working with parents who themselves might have cognitive delays?
Yeah. That's a great question. And I mean, sometimes, you know, the ability or the capacity of parents to respond is different. And some of it can be related to cognitive, some of it can be related to time. I mean, sometimes you're working with a parent who's working so many jobs just to put the food on the table that the reality of doing an intervention at home is just not there, or investing time in language strategies isn't there. I think what's really important is the same, you know, it is the flip side. It's the same conversation. It's engaging that parent in what are you doing in your home right now, and what's working, and asking them questions, because we don't, you know, if a parent is trying to do something, we want to find out what they're currently doing, how it's working. And I often find it's better not to reinvent the wheel, and this is actually any parent. I don't care what their abilities are. It's better not to reinvent the wheel, but rather tweak the wheel. Okay, you're already doing this. What if you did just changed it a little bit? Work with what they're already doing and look at subtle changes and small changes. If you're thinking about academic supports or things like, oh, well, they're just not getting help with homework or those kinds of difficulties, you may simply have to be looking at, you know, are there other tutor supports or other supports like that? Like, this parent is going to struggle to support their academic. Although many of us are having that difficulty with our kids in schools. My kid's, what they're doing, he's in junior high right now, and I don't even understand what he's doing, so I can't tutor him anymore anyway. So, but in terms of behavioral supports and things like that, I often look at the tweak, the slight change, as opposed to the radical change. That would be my biggest suggestion, which means having a conversation. We're not telling people what to do. We're asking, what are you doing and how can we work with that? So it's a bit different. We're not being as directive because we need to know how a house works first. And then we can say, okay, how are you supporting this? How are you helping them with homework time? Okay, well, an hour might be too long. I wonder if you could just say half an hour and then they could have a break and then do another half an hour. Would that make sense? Okay, great. I've supported them. They were already trying to do something. We broke it down.
Can you recommend certain tests for assessment of FASD? We talked earlier about the TOLD test and the, is it CREVT?
The CREVT?
Yeah, CREVT.
Yeah.
I wasn't going to
I know there's a lot of
pronounce
letters. We like letters. I don't know why. So do you mean a specific assessment of language? So really assessment of language currently, when we look at the folks who are doing the diagnosis of an FASD, they will use the kinds of tests that Carmen discussed, like the TOLD and the CREVT, as well as additional higher level tests of language, which is I'm not in a position to talk about because I'm not a speech-language pathologist. So when a speech-language pathologist does the assessment for diagnosis, typically, they're looking at a lot of higher-level language. So they're looking at narratives, they're looking at inferential language, those kinds of things so that they can draw some conclusions. They're going much beyond a lot of school-based assessments with a speech-language pathologist. They look at very, very basic language, receptive and expressive basic language. And sometimes that can look really okay, even though we said that, it can be problematic. In other kids, it actually looks okay. It's the higher level language where we see the greater problems, particularly as kids get older. So we often recommend, if you're doing a language assessment, and like I said, the clinics do, you really need to get a picture of those higher level language skills, getting beyond the basics. So something that tells you a little bit more about narrative language, storytelling language, inferential language, so that you could speak to those abstract language abilities. And there are tools that I'm not thinking of right. I think there's something called the OWLs. There's a frog book test that they do where they have to read a book. There's probably speech-language pathologists right out there right now crying because I'm trying to name them. I am not. I've just had the good fortune of working with some really fantastic speech-language pathologists, so I know the tools they like to use. Those would be the ones I would name.
What are your thoughts on the amount of time that students are expected to be at school, say like 5 days a week for 40 hours, and maybe that's too much time to expect out of somebody with FASD is the question?
Wow. I'm like, I don't know how to answer this. I mean, it's a lot of time, but they're going to be somewhere during that time. I guess it's a matter of thinking how we're going to spend that time. I mean, the nice thing about school for 5 days a week for that length of time is it's nice structured time where their days are set for them. I actually think that's great. There's structure, there's routine to a certain extent, as much as you're going to get anywhere in your life, you're going to get in a school setting. It's predictable. I'm going to the same place. I'm there for generally same periods of time. There's a lot of routine. Those are kind of nice. You can adapt to transitions. If we're fortunate, you're in the same school for many years in a row, so you even get to know the teachers. So those are good things. Now, how you spend that time is a different question. Should they be spending 5 days a week, all those hours sitting at a desk writing? No. How do we break that time up? How do we give them learning breaks and where do we put phys ed during the day? Can we bring in activity breaks during the day so that we break up academic tasks a little bit more? Sure, those are interesting things for us to think about. Where are our nutrition breaks, for instance? The more that we can build in even little nutrition breaks for somebody with an FASD is great, because then we can maintain, a bit more equilibrium for them. So if we start thinking about how we structure our day, I think that's a better conversation, in my opinion, than should we have the day. I think the structure is a great one. And frankly, on a real pragmatic level, I think caregivers need it too. I think it's a good, structured, safe environment for kids to be in so the caregivers can do things too. Like I think there's some real practical components there as well, but I think it's great structure. But having the structure and how we use the structure are two different things.
Thanks. We actually have a parent who's wondering where they can get the trainings to help their child. So I think that's specifically talking about the training from an SLP.
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, and Carmen can jump in if you know of anything. I mean, where can you access services from an SLP? You can talk to schools depending on the age of your child. There's also Alberta Health Services often has SLP services that are available through health centers. So you can access a speech language pathologist through a health center within the community. And a lot of times if you do that, the SLP will work with you a little bit, and so you could talk to them about, if they do a session, their child does a session with an SLP, they would then talk to the parent as well. I know, actually I've accessed those services for one of my children before, and it was a lovely experience in which the individual worked with my child not as frequently, but would work with me every session as well to equip me with the kind of strategies that I could maintain through the rest of the time. I think we had appointments at first every 2 weeks or something like that. So it wasn't really frequent. And because it's through Alberta Health Services, it's not an added expense. It's not like I'm accessing a private service that I can't afford. So there is the school services, but there are also community services. And sometimes it takes a little longer to access through a school system. And I do find that the community health service is something that we need to keep in mind as a potential resource depending on where you're living. Obviously, if you're in a more rural community, services are harder to access. But if you are in a community where the community health centers are available, that might be there for you. And you certainly can talk to your school as well.
Related to that, could you just reiterate for us the publication information on the study of SLPs working with parents versus SLPs working with students directly?
I don't have that with me. If that individual wants to email me, I can send them that citation. There's the ones that Carmen talked about.
The one that Carmen talked about.
Yeah,
Oh.
the references are all at the end.
Okay.
So the conference study was the law et al. Study, and you can actually get that online actually.
Great.
Because the Cochrane ones are online.
So the Cochrane study is the one, and the
And the
end
Cochrane
of
is online.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah,
excellent.
and then the other one you'd have to go through a search database, like through library database to get it, but.
Thanks.
So check the references at the end of our presentation. If the question was related to one of the things, because I mentioned a couple of things that weren't in our references, just off the top, if it's related to that, you can email me and I can send you references directly. But, and as Carmen said, that Cochrane reference is one of the ones that is publicly available. Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you to Dr. Rasmussen and Dr. Pai for your presentation today. We look forward to seeing them again in February 22nd from 9 to 11. We hope you'll be able to join us then. There will be an evaluation email to participants after this session, so if you would please respond. And Angie will continue to look at your email questions as well. So thanks very much for everyone's participation today.